program today. And I believe you all have a copy of his resume, and if you haven't read it yet, I encourage you to do so because there's some very interesting twists and turns. It was just a few years ago that the worst financial crisis since the 1930s gripped the global economy. While some countries have made a feeble recovery, those that haven't are shifting blame and faulting others for their sluggish growth. The debate has turned combative. The weapon of choice is financial, and it takes the form of one's currency. While not the conventional military weapon, provocative manipulations of one's currency that range from printing money to buy government bonds to currency devaluation and capital controls are being used as a means to revive struggling economies worldwide. These tactics have the potential to ignite an economic war, a war that could destroy faith in the U.S. dollar, damage our economy, and threaten our national security. In his book, our speaker exposes us to this new battleground of global finance and asks one of the most important economic questions today, which is whether our recent response for resuscitating a flagging economy is setting the stage for the next financial crisis. His reply is golden. He begins by sharing a fascinating story about his involvement with the Pentagon in designing and participating in a war game that used currencies in capital markets to gain insight on potential attacks on the U.S. dollar. In the next section, he provides a history of currency wars, of which there have been two, one in the 20s and 30s, the others in the 60s and 70s, and he writes that recent signs indicate that a third is quite possible. He concludes by pointing a way toward a more informed course of action, one that will be more effective in meeting the challenges of a global economic slump. While expressing confidence in America's economic ability to defeat any nation-state in battle, still, Mr. Rickards warns that if currency wars lead to rising inflation, eliciting more uncertainty, the U.S. could get dragged into asymmetrical warfare, and this would dramatically diminish America's role on the world stage. The question is, what can currency wars of the past tell us about threats today so that we can ward off another crisis? For the answer, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest today, Jim Rickards. Thank you for joining us. That golden was a little joke.
Right. Thank you, Joanne, for that introduction. It's indeed a pleasure to be here tonight. I take it we have some viewers of the webcast from all over the world, but for those of us in the audience, we know the weather is not ideal, and I especially thank you for coming out on a rainy evening here in New York. The weather may not be ideal, but I think our venue is, and I think we have a very distinguished audience here with us tonight, so I'm very pleased to be a part of this. We'll spend about 25 minutes or so in a sort of straight presentation, then we'll allow ample time for questions, so we'll have a half hour or so for questions and a little time to chat afterwards, so hopefully that's a good mix. I know I very much enjoy giving presentations like this, but personally my favorite part are the questions. I like to hopefully impart some learning, but I learn a lot as well from that part of the program, so I'm looking forward to that. So let's jump in. Probably the obvious place to start is what is a currency war? We're going to be talking about currency wars, and I think we're living through one. But what is a currency war? Just kind of from the beginning. It's actually a fairly simple concept. It starts with an insufficient growth. When the world economies are at a point where there's not enough growth to go around. When there's a lot of growth or economies are growing robustly, people don't care as much about the exchange rate. They always think about it. It's always an element of policy. But if there's kind of enough growth to go around, you don't care as much. But when the growth is insufficient, the temptation to steal growth from your trading partners by devaluing your currency becomes overwhelming, and that's really the origin of a currency war. And the way it works is very straightforward. U.S. has a lot of great exports available to the world. Take Boeing aircraft as an example. They make a fine plane, but there are a couple of competitors around the world. We have Airbus in Europe. We have Embraer in Brazil. China's developing an aircraft industry. So let's say you're a country like Indonesia. You need airplanes, but you don't have an indigenous aircraft industry, so you're going to go shopping around the world. I compare it to living in a small town. There are 4 stores. They all sort of sell the same thing. If one of those stores has a half-off sale, everyone's going to go to that store. So when you cheapen your currency, you make your stuff less expensive. for foreign buyers, and in theory they're going to buy your aircraft before they buy something from Airbus. That creates exports, that contributes to growth in the United States, creates jobs. Given the fact that we have a serious unemployment problem and insufficient growth in this country, if a program can create jobs and create growth, that sounds great. I mean, what's wrong with that? And that's the way a lot of politicians and policymakers look at it, and that's how this process of devaluing the currency begins. The problem is there are a lot of things wrong with it. They end very badly, very quickly for a number of reasons. First of all, the obvious fact that the United States imports more than we export. So sure, our exports might be a little bit cheaper at the margin. We might sell a few more planes and Microsoft software and Hollywood films, but we import an enormous amount, all those iPads and iPods and flat screen TVs and German cars and foreign vacations and a lot of other more basic inputs to the supply chain as well. The price of those will go up, and since we import more than we export, that actually is a way of importing inflation and price increases into the United States. That then begins to feed through the supply chain. Now this is, of course, we'll talk more about it, but this is exactly what happened in the 1970s after President Nixon cheapened the dollar in 1971. We set out on one of the worst periods of inflation bordering on hyperinflation in U.S. history between 1977 and 1981. Cumulative inflation over the 5 years was 50%, 50. It means the value of the dollar was cut in half. So that's one of the consequences of cheapening your currency and launching a currency war. The other one, which we saw more illustrative, I think, in the 1930s, is retaliation. If the U.S. could act in a vacuum, if we were the only country pursuing a policy, this might work for a short period of time. But sooner than later, and in today's world, almost instantaneously, other countries will begin to try to cheapen their currencies. Or if they lack this sort of economic muscle to be able to do that, I think Brazil is a good example of this, they'll do other things. They'll put on capital controls. They come in a lot of different flavors. You know, you invest in a country, they say, well, no more 30-day bank deposits. It's 6 months or a year, or we've even seen things like negative interest rates. So we're seeing capital controls in Switzerland, Brazil, Thailand, South Korea, and some other countries around the world. And then the third problem, in addition to importing inflation and inducing capital controls, is that currency wars quickly morph into trade wars. So countries will begin to put on import excise taxes, throw up other barriers to trade that actually reduce world trade and world economic output. And of course, that's what we saw in the 1930s. So there are a whole host of bad economic consequences. We've seen this before. One of the reasons I spend so much time on history in the book, in addition to economic analysis, is to make this point that we've said on this road before, and it has ended badly, and in my view will end badly again. So that's what a currency war is. That's how it's a simple temptation to steal growth from your neighbors by cheapening your currency, lowering the cost of your exports. It has all these bad negative consequences, feedback loops I described. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So let's now, with that as a frame of reference, go to the outline of the book itself and talk about this in more detail. As Joanne mentioned, the book has 3 parts. The first part is a little bit of a standalone. I think it's a good introduction and helps frame the issue globally. But in the first 2 chapters, we recount the first ever financial war game. This was conducted by the Pentagon in 2009. Took place at a top secret weapons laboratory outside of Washington called the Applied Physics Laboratory. Now the Pentagon's been conducting war games for 50 years, and before that nothing new about war games, and that's their job. There are all kinds of scenarios they have to deal with, whether it's potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or an Iranian attack on Israel, or Iran blocking the Straits of Hormuz. We all hope these things never happen, but we know that they might. It's a dangerous world, and the Pentagon needs to be prepared for that. What was different about this war game is that the rules were you could not use any what the military calls kinetic weapons, or things that shoot or explode. No amphibious invasions, B-2 bombers, no flanking maneuvers. The only weapons were stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities, and derivatives. I was invited in as a capital markets expert. The Pentagon did not need any help from me conducting a war game, but they did need help on the capital markets side. It's historically not a big part of the battle space, not a very important part of strategy during the Cold War. And I worked side by side with the game design team at the Applied Physics Laboratory, and we literally wrote the rules. It had never been done before. I call it playing Risk for adults, but it had a very serious side to it, of course. And we did some straightforward things. The teams are the ones you might expect. So it was the United States, Russia, China. We had sort of a conglomerate team where resources were limited, so we sort of lumped in Europe and East Asia as sort of group teams, but we also allow participation from non-state actors such as hedge funds, banks, and other financial regulators. So there was that component. We played it over 2 days. We had 3 moves. It's all described in the book. I don't have to go through it all in detail. I hope you enjoy those chapters. I'm not going to give away the ending, but I was, in addition to designing the game, I was invited to play on the China team. Had a close friend who is a Russian expert. Actually, had made his first visit to Russia in 1963 during the Khrushchev-Kennedy years. So he's the sort of the epitome of the old Russia hand, and invited him to play on the Russian team. Had another friend on the Swiss team. We cooked up some surprises for the Pentagon, tried to give them their money's worth, but I hope you enjoy those chapters. But it has a very serious side to it, clearly a learning experience. But when we look at the world today, events are actually unfolding faster than I would have thought a couple years ago.